Moving on to making Procreate gestures, you should have by now synchronized your Procreate preferences with the settings shown in this handout that we talked about at length last week. If you've yet to do so, please follow up with that later. The handout is pretty easy to follow. You simply match up your settings with the screen grabs that are shown. And moving forward, we're going to be using these geometric and organic shapefiles to implement gestures. Note that we're just glazing over all the gestures here, and that they'll be more fully explained in lab exercises to come. And also note that many of these gestures have equal counterparts found elsewhere in the interface, and those counterparts will be pointed out as we go along. Whether you use the gestures or those other counterparts is just a matter of preference. The first gallery gesture is one that's pretty useless and I doubt you'll ever want to use it, but I'm going to point it out. So I scroll down to my Sumi brush on rice paper file and I'm pinching and rotating clockwise, and you can see that the orientation switched from portrait to landscape. Now to get that back, I would maybe try to spin it back. Again, not so sure you'd ever want to use that, but it's there if you did want to. And if you recall in this video, you can preview multiple canvases by going into select mode and selecting multiple canvases, or all of them. And to select multiple canvases, I can either tap, or I'm going to point out another gesture where I can just brush over multiple canvases. I'm just going to drag my finger across multiple canvases and you'll see that they select, like so. And then I would tap the preview and swipe right or left. So we already talked about this method. I'm going to tap and then hit the X to exit that, and then I'm going to exit select mode. I have to get out of this stack as well. And getting back on point with our gestures, you can bypass the need to get into select mode to preview canvases by pinching out. So I'm pinching out on this pinkish calligraphy exercises thumbnail, the fourth canvas down. And then just like in select mode, I can swipe right or left to preview standalone canvases and canvases that are in stacks. If I wanted to exit preview, I would pinch back in, and when I pinch in here, I know that I'm in a stack. So I'm going to have to tap on the stack name, which is Snowfall Animation, to return to the gallery. Another thing you can do, I'm pinching back out on that pink file. If I wanted to open this file directly through preview, I would simply double tap, and I would get into my Open Canvas menu. I'm going to return back to the gallery. And then I'm going to left swipe on this canvas to show that you can share and duplicate that canvas. Duplicate is pretty straightforward, and that's identical to this duplicate here in the select menu. And the share selection is the same as the one when you left swipe. And these two handouts, which will be made available later, talk about sharing canvases at length. And just a refresher, we already talked about the stacks gesture in the canvas menu tour, but here it is again. You can stack items directly in the gallery by pressing and hovering over a second canvas and letting go. And those two geometric organic shapes were stacked. Again, I'm going to unstack them by going into the stack, pressing and dragging, and bringing that geometric on top of the stack name. And again, my organics is still in a stack, which I don't want, so I'm going to re-enter that and drag that back out of the stack. And again, rearranging is to press and drag. And as we mentioned earlier, this can be a little bit fiddly when you're rearranging stacks. Not too bad there, but when you try to squeeze a stack between two stacks, it can get a little hairy. And it's just a matter of finessing it just so. Let's move on to the open canvas gestures. To start in, I'm going to open up the Layers palette and tap the plus symbol in the upper right hand corner to make a new layer, because I don't want to mess with my current layers. And I'm going to press and drag that to the top of the stack, like so. We've yet to get into layer gestures, that's coming later, but since we're in here, One of the gestures is you can rearrange the layers by pressing and dragging like so. So let's get back to our canvas gestures. So in this new canvas, I'm going to make a few random marks to demonstrate the first two gestures. Which is the 2-finger tap to undo and the 3-finger tap to redo. And these two gestures can be done in rapid succession by pressing down. So to undo in rapid succession, I'm pressing 2 fingers to undo, and I'm pressing 3 fingers to redo. And I do believe you're allowed something like 250 undos and 250 redos. And to make certain that you're not inadvertently undoing and redoing, you might want to put a delay on these rapid successions, and you would do so here in the Actions palette and work this slider. So again, something down here, you're probably going to make a few inadvertent undos and redos, and up around here is a pretty reasonable delay. Moving on to our next batch of gestures, I'm going to do a 3-finger scrub to delete all of this, to clear everything on the layer. And I'm going to undo that 3-finger scrub by tapping with 2 fingers to show that you can do the same thing in the Layers palette by tapping that layer thumbnail and tapping this clear selection. Does the same thing, but a few steps to get to that clear. I'm going to tap one more time with 2 fingers to show that again with a 3-finger swipe. Another redundant way of doing it is to use the cut command. Now the difference between clear and cut is that the clear just wipes it out altogether, whereas when you cut it, it lurks in the clipboard. So if I were to 3-finger swipe again and tap paste, it comes back. The copy and paste palette that appears with a 3-finger swipe is discussed at length in this video. I'm going to exit this transform mode by tapping the highlighted blue arrow up at the top of our menu here. And once and for all, I'm going to 3-finger scrub to clear this layer. And that scrub is just a back and forth scrub. And I'm going to use my sliders over here to reduce the size of my brush size to make a couple of vertical marks for 2 particular reasons. I'm going to make my first brush, let me go into my palettes and pick some colorful colors here. So I'm going to make a vertical line. Drawing that out, I'm holding, and we get a quick shape. You can see up above, there's a gray strip that says line created. Now, if I were to press with a finger on the other hand, I could constrain the angle of that particular line in 15-degree increments. When I release my finger, I can go back to freeform. So I'm going to tap and make it perfectly vertical. Now I'm going to create another line out further. Same way, I'm just drawing, and I'm going to put my finger down to constrain that to a 90-degree angle, which is good. And let's just draw one more for good measure. There's a reason for this. I'll show in just a bit. So way out here, I'm going to draw a purple line. Hold down my finger to constrain that to 90 degrees. Now the reason for these vertical rules is to demonstrate a little bit of a slider action where I am back over to the sidebar and my stylus is directly atop my brush size slider. And as I scrub up and down, I can quickly get from 1% to 100%. Let's say that I wanted to size my brush at 4% and the slider keeps slipping between 3 and 5% and I can't seem to nail that 4. I can have more control. While my stylus is still pressed down, I'm going to drag horizontally away from that slider. And then as I scrub vertically, I have much more precision trying to pinpoint a particular increment. Now I'm out just about by the pink line that I drew, and I have to scrub probably about 3 or 4 inches before I actually knock it down to another increment or knock it up to another increment. And as I still pressing and dragging out to the green rule, as I scrub vertically, I pretty much have to scrub completely from top of the image to bottom to nudge 1 increment. So let's not even talk about the purple. That just is going to not even move. Now this is a pretty useful gesture to know about because this drag out slider gesture applies to absolutely every slider seen in the Procreate interface. So the best way to see how this works is to just try it yourself. And the next two gestures to discuss are the zoom in and zoom out gestures. You would zoom in by pinching out. And you could also rotate. I'm pinching in and out and rotating at the same time. And say that I'm working on this particular part of the frog's toe, and I'm really getting busy here, working on the water droplets or whatever, and I wanted to zoom back out to get a view of the big picture. I'm going to pinch in to zoom out. And now if I wanted to get exactly back to that frog's toe, the same exact area that I was working on, I would quickly pinch out again, and I would get right back to that same exact spot. And again, I'm going to pinch in to zoom back out. In another gesture, Procreate already has a fantastic, very streamlined interface, but if you were really getting busy and you wanted no distractions, you could completely lose the interface by doing a 4-finger tap. And then if you wanted to reinstate that menu view, you would 4-finger tap again to toggle it back into view. My current brush is this acrylic brush, and my current eraser is this soft eraser. So having laid down a couple of strokes with this acrylic brush, and maybe wanting to remove some of that pigment, I might do just fine using the current soft eraser. But what if I wanted to remove pigment with the same brush that laid down that pigment? I can do so by long pressing on the eraser tool, and when I do, you're going to see an erase with current brush message appear. Little gray slivers are going to slide down. These tiny little gray alerts slide in and out of view pretty quickly, and I had to pause the video so you could see the thing. So now when I tap on the eraser, you can see in fact that the acrylic brush was selected. And this works the opposite way, where you can paint with the current eraser. So I'm going to change the eraser to this acrylic glaze brush. Okay, so now if I long press on the brush, let's just select the brush first to show that that's still the wet charge dilute. I'm going to select the eraser. I'm going to come back and long press on the brush, and we'll see that little sliver show up saying paint with current brush this time as opposed to erase with current brush. Now when I choose that, you can see that it changed from the wet charge dilute to the acrylic glaze, which again is the same brush that the eraser is using. In the Tour of the Canvas menu video, mention was made about doing a color drop where you would drag the color menu icon onto a layer. So this time I'm going to drag inside of this triangle, and in the second round I'm going to drag outside of the triangle. And then I'm going to tap with 2 fingers to undo those 2 fills. And I'm going to adjust this triangle layer and this pentagon layer in order to demonstrate 2 extremes in terms of color drop thresholds. So I'm going to make sure that my triangle layer is still selected, and I'm going to blur the edges of that triangle by selecting the adjustments menu item in the upper left, and I'm going to choose Gaussian blur from the drop down, and I'm going to choose layer, not pencil. And that will call up this Gaussian blur prompt, which is telling me to slide to adjust the blur. So the further to the right I drag, the more blurry. The further to the left, the less blurry. So I'm going to set that at about 4% for this demonstration. That'll do it. And I'm going to exit the adjustment by tapping the magic wand again. And now I'm going to modify the pentagon by first selecting that layer. And I'm going to choose a very soft eraser to do so. I've got airbrush, soft brush for this, and I'm going to zoom in, and I'm just going to, with a very small brush, create a little bit of a color leak. Now note that this is not a 100% unclogged color leak. There's a little bit of artifact, there's a little bit of yellow left from that stroke. If it were completely unclogged like so, then what I'm about to do wouldn't work. So I'm going to come back and redo that with just a little trace. And I'm just trying to simulate one of those situations where you might have drawn a cartoon perhaps and you didn't completely close the lines. Anyway, let's move forward with our modifications here. I'm going to start in with the purple triangle by selecting that layer. And were I to do a simple color drop now with that blurred edge, you can see we get this pixelated edge that doesn't quite flood that feathered area. So I'm going to tap and undo that and invoke the color threshold. Now, just like the Gaussian blur, I'm going to have to slide from left to right, and I want to give myself as long of a runway as possible to go from 0 to 100%. So let me just back up here. If I would do the color drop and hold, you can see that gray prompt up above says that my threshold is currently at 0, which is the extreme left edge of my picture area. So I'm going to tap and get out of that and start again. And to make sure that my stylus starts up here, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to zoom and bring my triangle all the way up there. And that should allow me to get closer to 100% where I need to be. So I'm going to do another color drop. I'm going to press and hold. And now my stylus is really close to 0%, so when I drag, I can get up close to 100%. So you can see that as I'm dragging left and right, the closer I get to 100, I'm actually flooding right up against that feathered area, which I'll zoom into in just a second. Dragging your fill object to the extreme edge like this is a bit of a stunt, but a longer runway gets the job done in just one pass. And you can see now that my threshold is up at 96.9%, so that's going to be the last threshold remembered when I do the same to the pentagon. So I'm going to release, and I'm going to zoom up to show you, in fact, that that feathered in pretty nicely with that threshold. So now I'm going to take on that color leak and the yellow pentagon, and I'm going to first make sure I have the right layer selected. And again, always check your layers. And then I'm going to choose a color to offset that yellow stroke. That's good. Now remember, this time I'm going to be lowering the threshold as opposed to raising the threshold. And so I'm going to be dragging from right to left as opposed to left to right like I did with the triangle. So I'm going to try to get this pentagon as close to the right-hand corner as possible for a longer runway. And now as I drag and hold this color drop for the threshold, I believe that my threshold is remembered at 96.9%. So I'm going to press and hold, and it's 96.9. So as I drag to the left, you can see as I get closer to 22.7, the lower I go, you can see that I can choke up on that little color leak. So I'm going to let go right there. That's pretty good. Now as soon as I let go of this, a continue refilling with color prompt quickly slides into view. And I want to tap that as quickly as possible, so it's a quick move. Continue filling with recolor, I choose that, and you can see that I get this little cross here. So let me see if I can move this over. And I'm going to drag that crosshair onto my yellow stroke to isolate that flood to the rule itself. And you can see in addition to the crosshair, I get this little flood slider. So I can go back and forth with that slider to increase the flood. Now let's try to match up that yellow stroke to the orange fill by playing around with that. And you can see if I go the other way, I get this little bit of a opposite fill here. So I want to come as close as I can. That looks like that's about as close as I'm going to get. So now I'm going to exit this flood fill mode by tapping the adjustments icon above. And then I'm going to come up to my little leak area. I'm going to grab a fine pencil, a fine tip, and I'm just going to do a little touch up to adjust that flood area. I need to bump up my opacity to do that. And so those are your two extremes with color threshold. And just a reminder that you can toggle your primary and secondary color wells here, which we have a white and an orange color well. So if I were to long press on that color selection, I can toggle back and forth between the orange and the white. And if you recall, this is very fiddly. Say that I wanted to change that white color well to green, say. Now let's do blue. Let's do a complementary color. Green and orange will be kind of yucky. Okay, so we've got a purpley color well. Now for this to stick, I need to make a mark, and before I make a mark, let me actually create a layer. I don't want to mess up my geometrics here. And I'm going to long press and drag that to the top. So now on that layer, with that newly filled color well, I need to make a mark for that purple to stick to that well. So I'm going to come back to my orange and paint with the orange. And now in a perfect world, when I long press, I'm at orange, I want to toggle back to the purple, I'm going to press, I get back to the purple. I'm going to long press and toggle back to the orange. Now this gesture is extremely useful when we start working with masks. You're going to be painting between black and white, and that'll make sense later. And as mentioned in the previous video, these primary and secondary color wells are used by brushes that use color dynamics. And so the last gesture before we move on to layer gestures is the ability to move your sidebar here, which regulates the brush size, opacity, and the modifier button, which we have configured to our quick menu. You should have that set up. If not, refer to that PDF again. So firstly, if you were a lefty, you might want to move that sidebar to the right hand side. But whichever side you choose, you can adjust that sidebar by dragging out from the black margin area of your iPad and then dragging that sidebar up and down. Again, you move from the very edge of your iPad screen to drag it out and then move it up or down. I like it in the center, so that's good enough. Okay, let's move on to the layers gestures. Starting in on the layers gestures, I'm going to tap the layers icon, and then I'm going to tap this layer 4 thumbnail. And the thumbnail is the square area where you can actually see the pixels. And so when I tap that thumbnail, I get this drop-down menu. And some of these menu items we're going to discuss here in this video, and then others will be covered in dedicated videos and exercises. So starting in at the very top, I'm going to tap rename, and I could use my keyboard to rename that, or this time around I'm going to use my Apple Pencil. So I'm going to scribble that layer 4 and hit cut, and then I'll just rename it orange blob. And it's pretty impressive that the iPad can decipher my chicken scratch. Let's go back into the thumbnail here and see what else we can work with. The select, when I tap that, is going to actually select those pixel areas. And you can see the marching ants. And let me go back into actions. We talked about this last week, where we can use this slider to bump up the selection mask visibility. So I'm going to keep it where it is, but I just want to make sure you could see that that selection was made. And now what that does, I'm going to create another layer and hide this one. And you can see that we still have our selection active. So the diagonal patterned area is protected from my brush, and the white areas are not protected. So on that new layer, when I make some brush marks, it's like painting with a stencil. And then to deselect, you just tap on the little selection icon over on the left hand side of the menu and deselect it. So I'm going to delete this layer 5 by left swiping and tapping delete. Lock and duplicate are pretty self-explanatory. And know that I'm going to be nagging you to lock layers that you're not currently using, because when you inadvertently draw or paint on the wrong layer, it makes for some pretty painful and annoying situations. Another way of invoking that select is actually, rather than tap on the thumbnail, I can actually just press on the layer with 2 fingers and it calls up the same thing. And you can see that I don't have the layer visible, but it will still select the pixels on that layer, whether hidden or not. So case in point, I'm going to hide the triangle layer and I'm going to press with 2 fingers. And you can see that this time the triangle was selected. And know that we will be getting to selections and transformations later on. Now let's bring our attention to these layer visibility checkboxes. When they're checked on, obviously the layer is visible. Unchecked, invisible. If I wanted to just show my orange ellipse, I could long press on that checkbox and it would hide the other layers. If I want to bring those layers back into view, I could long press again on the orange checkbox and bring them back into view. Same thing, I'm going down to the triangle and I'm tapping on that. Now my triangle is the only one in view. Driving it home, I'm long pressing on the pentagon, hiding everything else, long pressing again, everything comes into view. While I do this, notice that the background checkbox is not affected. You've got to manually do that one. You can select multiple layers by right swiping different layers, and those multiple selections can be transformed in tandem, among other things. I'm going to get out of that and do a 2-finger tap to undo all of that. Your multiple layers can be grouped by selecting the group menu selection in the upper right hand corner of the layers palette. That group can be collapsed and uncollapsed, and also tap on it to rename. I'm going to 2-finger tap to undo all of that and look for my gray sliver up above to make sure I've undone the grouping. Okay, so they're ungrouped. And since we're on the topic of layer gestures, I'm going to repeat what was already explained in another video by dragging these guys out. So pressing and dragging on the darker of the highlighted layers, the 2 dimmer selected layers will come along for the ride. So I'm going to press and drag out. You can see the number of layers selected in that grouping, and I'm not going to let go. In the upper right hand corner, you can see that I've got 3 layers selected. In pressing down and not letting go, I'm going to use my free hand to tap the gallery menu icon in the upper left, and then navigate to the file in which I'd like to drop these layers. And then I'm going to open the layers palette by hovering over the layer menu icon. I'm going to hover above the flower filled. I can move around, and wherever I let these go, that's where they're going to be placed. Having synchronized your gesture settings to last week's handout, you should have this layer selection toggled on to touch and hold. And with that in place, you should be able to select layers without having to go into the layers palette. So currently we can see that butterfly filled is the current layer, and when I press and hold on this overlap, I'm sort of on top of the pentagon and the palm tree, and I get these 2 layers. So I'm going to highlight the pentagon stroked, and when I release and then open the layers, you can see that I went to the pentagon layer. So let's go back over to the flower and the triangle and try that again. And that one is a little bit more clear cut, so I'm just getting the triangle like so. Let's go down to the butterfly and the orange circle. So you can see that when you're sort of overlapping 2 layers, you can select one or the other. There may be 3 or 4 depending on what you've got pressed down on. So I'm back to the butterfly. So now I'm going to group select the geometrics. I'm going to tap the pentagon, and then I'm going to swipe to the right to group select the other geometrics, and then I'm going to tap the group selection in the upper right hand corner to group them. And while I'm at it, I'm going to tap the thumbnail and rename, this time with a keyboard. And then I'm going to tap the checkbox, the visibility checkbox, to hide those. And I'm going to zoom into the flower to talk about 2 other different gestures in layer menu items. So tapping on the flower filled icon, we have this alpha lock selection. And as soon as I tap that alpha lock, any of these menu selections, when you invoke them, I'm going to tap back to see the check mark. So you will see all of these different selections having this check mark. It's a visual cue that it's been invoked. Another part of this alpha lock, if you look up close, you can see the thumbnail has a checkered background, which is an indicator that the transparent parts of that layer are protected from your paintbrush. Another way of invoking this alpha lock, I'm going to turn it off here and then show you what it does. So the second way of doing that is to brush to the right with 2 fingers on your layer, like so. You'll see a little bit of a bounce and you'll see the checkered background. And when I go back in again, you can see that that alpha lock is invoked. So what that does, I currently have this orange color filled, and when I use my brush, I'm going to select Find Tips Good for this. I'm going to zoom in and maybe color that orange center. And you can see, and I'm going to turn off the background so you can see more clearly, that I'm not able to paint anywhere on the transparent part of the layer. I'm going to double tap and get rid of that. So with that, I can go around and play around with my petals. I'm going to choose that color, the coral color that the flower currently is. I'm going to press my modifier key and hold down my Apple Pencil to choose that color. Again, those are part of those preferences you should have set. And I'm just going to go into my value and just maybe change the hue ever so slightly to something more purpley. Maybe I'll bump up the saturation as well. So anyway, back on point with the layer commands. And now what I can do with that alpha lock is I can do a color drop and colorize select areas of that transparency. And now inside of the layers palette again, I'm going to tap the thumbnail. There's a color fill command which will fill absolutely every part of the layer as opposed to just one petal at a time. So if I tap this fill layer, I'm going to fill the entire flower with that particular color that's selected, like so. So again, just remember that fill layer is a broad sweep, and the color drop on an alpha locked layer will allow you to do one island of color at a time. To review the alpha lock gesture, I'm going to swipe with 2 fingers to the right, and when I do, you'll see that checkerboard pattern behind the flower disappear. And reopening that drop-down menu by tapping the layer icon, we'll be picking off the rest of these menu items in dedicated videos and exercises. But let's wrap up this long-winded video with 2 more layer gestures. And so I'm tapping on the N, which is right next to the visibility checkbox. And the N stands for normal in terms of a blend mode, and we'll talk about blend modes later. But when I tap on that N, I just want to talk about this opacity slider right here. You can also, without having to tap the N to open this up, you can call up a layer opacity slider by tapping with 2 fingers on that layer. And you get this blue slider, and just like our other sliders, you move left to right to increase and decrease. And finally, our very last layer gesture is to merge layers. Now I could tap the layer thumbnail and then select merge down, and that will merge one layer at a time. I'm going to tap with 2 fingers to undo that. But an easier way is to pinch layers together, and I'm going to pinch all 3 of these layers together, like so. And so that wraps up all of our gallery, our canvas, and our layer gestures. Thanks for getting through this video, which was the longest one by far, but with a granular understanding of these layer gestures, they'll become second nature that much quicker. And being a guru with layer gestures, you'll certainly blow past most Procreate users.